reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell onto the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen."
What I want to do this morning is provoke questions and curiosity. It's not important to me. I hope this is true every week, but it's more true this morning than ever, I hope, which is it's not important to me that we agree in the end with the answers to the questions. I'm not operating on the assumption that all of our questions will even be the same or even that would be appropriate. But it feels to me like we're in this gap where it's a strategic moment to just ask some questions, to hopefully spark some curiosity, to hopefully send you away from here with more thoughts and musings and questions and curiosity than you showed up with. Now, if you're brand new to Narrate or if you've not been here for a while, just to kind of put you on a timeline, we just finished up last week what was a 16-month series through the Gospel according to Matthew, which makes that series about 16 times longer than any series we'd done before that. We didn't know it was going to be that long. I didn't know why we started into Matthew other than the fact that that's what I was doing in my time. I think one of the things that happened in the end was it was like everything had been thrown up in the air culturally. And because of that, it was like everybody was talking, and so therefore nobody had credibility. And for many of us, what happened in that season was this sense of like, let's just return to this 2,000-year-old voice, the Gospel according to Matthew, this 2,000-year-old person, Jesus of Nazareth. Let's sit with who he was and how he saw the world and why he's mesmerized people and even caused so many millions to worship him as God. So we wrapped that up last week. Next week, or rather, not next week, but on the 11th, because we won't be here next week, we'll come back to that. On the 11th, we're starting a brand new series called Your Mental Game, Back to the Basics. And part of what we're going to try to do there is an amalgamation of who we used to be and what we used to do by way of series and what we just did. And what I mean by that is obviously it's topical. It just feels appropriate for us to just open the pages of Scripture in these ancient lives and go, what wisdom might they have for us in this current mental health crisis? It's in no way an attempt to discredit any of the current voices, but rather an honest attempt to go, sometimes the best wisdom is found from outside of the time that we're living in, and there's this profound sense that maybe there's some low-hanging fruit that we're looking past, that ancient people and ancient people of faith went like, no, this is strategic. We want to do that, but we also want to do it in ways that utilize science and medicine, and we're going to have some experts up here throughout the series, and we're going to do it kind of long-form-wise as it relates to Scripture, which means, unlike this morning, we're not just going to kind of piecemeal a few verses and form a message. We're going to take like Romans chapter 12 or 1 Corinthians chapters 4 and 5 and do it that way. But that means there's this week, and historically this would be called Vision Weekend. I don't know to what extent we've even done Vision Weekend the last couple of years. It's almost been a mortal sin to have vision for the future the last couple of years, and that's not a commentary. It's just this honest, like, how do we think about the future? But what I want to do this morning is it feels to me, and it's possible that I'm projecting, that emotionally and relationally and even just strategically in life, though we call January the start of the year, it feels in so many ways like September starts the rhythm of the next year. And so what I would like to do is take this week to again ask these bigger picture questions. And to be perfectly honest with you, if you're a guest and you've never been here, it'll be a little weird because it's a little bit more like a family meeting than it is this kind of broad scope sermon. And that doesn't mean we're not thrilled that you're here or even that there won't be something with you, but just kind of naming that. And also, to a greater extent than is oftentimes the case, I hope, we're speaking more directly this morning to those of you who identify as followers of Jesus and are trying to figure out, therefore, how do you do that in the months and the years that lie ahead? And I think really the jumping off point, we can go to that next slide, Holly, is just this question in the last couple of years. How has your need for or interest in doing faith and community changed? Again, this is a classic question in my mind. Like, I'm not assuming we're all going to have the same answer. And to some extent, I suppose that's okay. But what I think the starting point of really assessing these last couple of years, if we're to be honest and name the elephant, it starts by just going, to what extent does something like this still have value for you? To what extent is it still a priority? And I ask that knowing that the answers are all over the room. I get to spend time with many of you, and some of you, like, the value of Sunday is greater than it's been in recent memory, maybe for some of you since college. I've watched as some of you went from barely ever to almost always, and that's not a value observation, it's just an observation. Some of you are in the exact opposite spot. I just met with someone this last week who has followed Jesus for, I would think, most of his life. He's been a part of the practices and church and all those things for decades. And he looked at me, and I appreciated his honesty. He said to me this week, he said, Adam, I haven't gone to church or done any practices for the last 6 months, and I'm not any worse for wear. Like, I don't feel any different. I don't miss anything. I don't miss anyone. That might be where you're at. And I think that, too, is like, okay, so at least you know where you're at, because that then helps us move forward and begin to ask these other questions. You know, I was watching what was the last game of the Helena Reps this last July. I had a son who played on that, and if you're not familiar with Helena American Legion Baseball, that's more or less the JV team. It was an elimination game in Butte, America. It was the first time I've ever been to a game in Butte where it wasn't 10 degrees and blowing 50 miles an hour. It was a beautiful day. I was standing on this berm, and what was unique about this day was not only that it was an elimination game, but the head coach of the whole program was there, because the head coach of that team was sick. And so I think that got my wheels turning in different ways. And in particular, what I started thinking about as every kid came up to bat, or as every kid took the field, and it's all kind of subconscious until I later realized it, but what I was starting to evaluate players, and what was going through my head was this: arrow up, arrow down. Like, how would I view them 62 games later? And I think in some ways I was trying to imagine how John Burnett, the coach, was thinking about them, because this is the way sports work. At the start of the season, it was very clear from the organization that there were some kids that they had the arrow way up on them. There was this sense of, like, who are they going to be, and they're developing, and we'll probably be able to use them on the varsity someday. And some of them, as I'm watching, I'm like, yeah, I think the arrow's still very much up. And some of them, I think what we learned this year is, like, now their best days are behind them. There were other kids that at the start of the season, it was pretty clear through different kind of mechanisms, obvious ones like playing time, that they saw their arrow is down. And watching that game, it was obvious that they still saw some of them as their arrow down, and I would have shared that opinion. Others, there were kids who, at the start of the year, they were want for playing time, and here they were starting or something. I didn't think much about it until I was back in the office that Tuesday, and Hannah was teaching that week, which she always does such a good job, and so I just was getting to emotionally zoom out and think about weekends like this. I like the way Dave Ramsey talks about sometimes you have to work, you can't just work in it, but you got to work on it. And I felt like I was just trying to be attentive to, okay, Lord, we got this thing August 28th, and there's this week that we've given ourselves to just speak to the bigger picture. And I found myself, I grabbed a piece of paper, which is a new practice for me as I'm trying to work on some of my technology habits, and I grabbed a pen, and I just started writing, and at the very top I wrote, is Narrate's arrow up or down? Found myself wondering, like, how do I see Narrate? Which, again, is my second question, I guess. How do you see it? And I'm operating on the assumption that we all see it differently. And that's okay, especially if it just means, like, we have a starting point. My answer to the question, for what it's worth, and I'd love to hear yours to the extent that you want to go for a walk or something, my answer is I genuinely see it as very up. My own personal energy, the staff's energy, I can genuinely go, like, we're as good, if not better, than ever. As a staff, something awesome happened with COVID, where we started almost every day together having these high leverage conversations that were some part trivial, but other parts, like, they mattered, and it created a bond and a connection that I'm thrilled to work with the team that we currently work with. I also get to have lunches and coffees and exchange emails and prepare to baptize people like many of you in this room. I've had a front row seat to see that many of you are leaning into your faith in ways that, frankly, I've never seen in my 20 years of working in church. There's something happening, and while there's lots of negativity that gets lots of attention, I sit with people who were, like, completely unchurched, and they're suddenly asking these really big picture questions about life and its purpose and how are we supposed to do this. I just sat recently with somebody, and what blew me away was just their patience. Like, they have this huge attraction to Jesus right now, but not this like anxious, I got to figure this out next week, this genuine kind of spirit-laden, like I'm going to spend the rest of my life getting to know this God. That leaves me encouraged. And yet I think we all know we're living in a very tender, a very strategic time. Like it could go either way. Now, on the one hand, I have to say, I was actually just telling a friend this week, like, I'm encouraged about the future of the church. I mean, how could you not be? If you're reading the scriptures, the church is fine. It's going to be fine. What I'm worried about is me. Like, it's not whether or not the church is fine, it's whether or not I'll be a part of it in the future and whether or not this form will be fine. But I think the bigger question is, like, so where are you headed? And how do you do this? And what stands out to me is it is a strategic time. It is this time where if we just operate like it's 2007 again, we probably will miss some things. You know, one of the verses, and I was listening to Dallas Willard recently. It was actually when I was preparing for the last message last week, and I listened to his book, The Great Omission, which I've never read before because I knew it was about, and I knew it would indict me in my career because it was all about the church isn't making disciples, so I never read it. I read it this last spring and summer, or listened to it rather, and one of the things he said in there was, if your church doesn't have some kind of verse memorization program, find a new church. So I started memorizing verses. And the one that's been the most powerful for me is this Colossians 4:2, where the Apostle Paul says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. And I just feel like this verse for me speaks into the present cultural moment better than maybe anything I've read. Because there's two postures going on, aren't there? Like on the one hand, the call, the command, the summons to be thankful, it means walk out your door and see a God-bathed world. It means be optimistic. It means be grateful. It means see the good. It means like you can be encouraged. And for me, that's a powerful reminder. But then there's this other word, watchful, which to me, it feels like the opposite posture, doesn't it? Like if thankful is about like taking a high view and expecting the best, watchful, at the very least, it acknowledges like, hey, there's things that we should be watching for. There's dangers that we should be awakened to. There's these really important strategic moments. Like watchful is also this summons. And I'd like to think that over these next few questions, that's what we're trying to do, is going like, okay, so here from my perspective is what we should be watchful of. I'm not a doctor. I don't ever intend to be one. I don't want to trivialize the use of the word malpractice. I work hard not to give you just my opinions on Sunday, but what I want to do is ask some questions that hopefully spark curiosity that from my perspective over the last 16 to 24 months, to not just kind of put them on the table and ask you to wrestle with them would be malpractice in the theological sense on my part. So here's the first one. How will you give boundaries to technology in general and screens and social media in particular? I'm probably not asking anything that you haven't asked about. My own internal sense is this isn't just a relational decision, it's a spiritual decision. Like God gave us minds. Paul talks about communing with God through our minds constantly. And while I don't want to be the one who lives paranoid of everything around us, it seems clear that on some level we have to sit with the far-reaching fingers of big tech and ask genuine questions about how much ground we're going to give to those things. That doesn't mean we're all going to conclude the same things. It doesn't mean even that we're all going to go off the grid. I'm not trying to be an extremist. But from a purely spiritual standpoint, whether you're parenting a 2-year-old or yourself a college kid or you're 70 years old with an iPhone, I think if you stop and pay attention to it, your habits are fundamentally different than before you had an iPhone, than before you could stream Netflix, than before many of these things. And I'm not suggesting they're all bad, but it does seem that it fits within the be watchful, be thankful. Because we can find you if you get lost hunting. But be watchful. How are we going to sit with this? If you're not familiar with Cal Newport and his book, Digital Minimalism, I would dare say that should be the next book that you can read. He's not a Christian, as I know. He's a Georgetown professor who used to be at MIT, who's asking some really big questions about tech and putting them in very practical terms. Number 2, and I think these are closely related, to what extent, if any, will you give place and priority to face-to-face relationships and their myriad inconveniences. Again, if we were to just take account of what's changed in the last 5 years, we have access to isolation in ways that we didn't before that. We come, and by we I mean Christians, we come from this really strong tradition of hospitality. It was one of the things that uniquely made Jewish people in their world and Christians in theirs. It involves bringing people into your home, not because Martha Stewart just visited, but because it's your home. We come from this strong tradition where if we were really to step back, most of our spiritual practices, even sacraments, they happened not in places like this, though there's a place for that. They happened around dinner tables with meals on the table. I think one of the questions we have to ask is, when's the last time you had somebody without your last name in your house? When's the last time you've extended hospitality? To what extent are we still going to be formed by face-to-face relationships? I like the way Jonathan Peugeot talks about, at very best, if we do all of our relationships through online platforms, at best, we've allowed something that used to be free to become monetized. And that should give us caution. I was meeting with a friend recently who's been going to AA for a couple years, and he said, Adam, my favorite thing about AA is I sit in this room, and there's women and men who are decades into their recovery, and I listen to them speak. And then on a daily basis, in the same room, there's people who have been sober for hours, days, weeks, and I listen to them speak. And without being judgmental, he said the contrast in the wisdom and the kindness and just the value of people that these people who are decades into being free from alcohol, from these others, he said, it blows my mind. And then he said this, and my agenda here is not alcohol, just to be clear, but then he said this, he said, I go just to experience that contrast, if nothing else, because I want to be like those people, the decades-long people. I think the question that we have to ask is, can we replace the kind of learning that happens and those kinds of inspirational moments and those kinds of flesh-on-flesh, if you will, relationships, can we replace them with a screen, with a text message? To what extent does our mental health connect us back to the need for people? I think that gets into a third question. What's your commitment to and need for the Sunday church experience? Now, again, let me just try to be as honest as I can. The point at which my heart sees you through the lens of they come or they don't come, I'll quit. That doesn't mean it doesn't take work for me. It doesn't mean this last year hasn't been extremely difficult in some of those respects. But I'm committed to this not being a place that values you based upon the regularity that you attend. Somehow we have to separate that, though, from this bigger question of, is it best? We made light of, in the last season, a world where like once a month was the new every week, and we've just kind of watched soccer schedules and all kinds of other things fill Sundays and push things away. I think one of the questions that at least is worth asking is whether or not that's still the best thing for your journey of faith. You know, in Deuteronomy 15, Moses is recorded, and this is just one of the many instances in Deuteronomy, he says, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. What stands out to me is part of the sacred tradition of the people in the text is remembering. The priority is not always learning new things. It's sitting in narrative and being formed and shaped, committing ourselves and recommitting. I hope that that's even part of what the weekly communion thing is doing, is it's this weekly perpetual reminder, I am Christ's and he is mine. I think at least we have to sit with the question in this cultural moment, in where you're trying to get to in your faith, how negotiable is the Sunday experience? I was hanging out with a friend recently who was thanking me for the online feed, and it was a sincere thanks. It's the usual things. I'm so glad I get to catch up with it on Tuesday night, and I'm so glad I get to watch it when I'm camping in the woods. And it was a very sincere thanks. I didn't want to attack that. But because I've known this person for quite a long time, I met them at their very worst, or maybe not their very, I wouldn't know that, but it was pretty dark. And now I so enjoy getting together with them because they're the type of person who's growing and making hard decisions. And you know how like disciplined people, they just inspire energy in you. And he's one of those people. And so after he was kind of sharing that compliment, I said, can I just give you some honest feedback for just a second? And he said, yeah, sure. And I said, I get all that. But here's what's not true when you watch this from your camper in the woods. Here's what's not true when you catch up on Thursday night, is we miss out on you. Because you and your wife are awesome, and you bring energy, and you're fun, and you're inspiring right now. And when you're not in the room, like we don't get to grow with you. We don't get inspired to pursue Jesus more because of you. I think part of what we have to sit with is to what extent do we need that? That's what makes AA work. The 40-year-old guy doesn't need to be there. He's there for reasons fundamentally, mostly anyway, different than himself. Or there's a thing in Acts, and I always kind of swore that I'd never speak from this from stage, but it is a challenging text. He says they devoted themselves, speaking to the early church, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. I think, and this just might be my own bias, my own insecurity, my own whatever, I think that the way we did church in the 2000s, it seemed to have worked pretty good, the loosey-goosey when it's convenient. But again, this is just the Adam's opinion. We can disagree. I am convinced that the times are fundamentally different, and it's not going to work anymore. I was meeting with a professor several years ago. He'd been in town to speak. It was the first time that it was scary because I disagreed with him. We were having lunch at the airport before he boarded his plane. And after spending a weekend with us and hearing about the way we do church, again, this was 6 or 7 years ago, he said, Adam, I think the way you guys do church is going to lead to kids who don't follow Jesus. I was offended. I can now appreciate, he's from Portland. They're a decade or two ahead of us. He was like on the front lines calling back to us. And his point is the disconnect from the remembering, the disconnect from relationship. Adam, I've come back from the front lines and I'm telling you, it doesn't work. Again, you ultimately get to pay your fee and make your choice. I think it's something worth sitting with. Number 4, to what extent, if any, will you give priority to specifically Christian formation practices? And I ask this, Christian there is intentional, because there's not a person in this room that doesn't have spiritual formation practices. Like this morning, in a moment of laziness, when my alarm went off early and I was getting ready, I put Tom Hackett. Is it Tom Hackett? Is that who's the new Broncos coach? Something Hackett. He's funny. I put his post-game thing on as I was getting ready for church because I didn't get to watch the game last night, and listen to it. That's a spiritual practice. It's forming and shaping. To get out of bed and roll over and look at your Snapchat, that's a spiritual practice. To fall asleep at night staring at your phone, at the very least, I think we should acknowledge that in that moment, you're still doing a spiritual practice, but people from other eras, they fell asleep praying in those moments. Like to have a pattern where you always watch a show, these are all practices, and I'm not suggesting none of them are of any value, but I do wonder to what extent do we respect the tradition before us that recognizes there's these spiritual practices like reading scripture and prayer and things like Sunday and getting together with people and talking. To what extent do these have value? And I get like different seasons of life give us access to different principles. Please don't hear me kind of saying there's any one, but just what are they? This Eastern Orthodox French thinker who wrote a book called The New Media Epidemic, it's really worth reading and it's quite readable. He has this quote from his book, and I think it's pretty profound. Go ahead. He says, many users, speaking of just tech, many users give the new media a central place in their lives, the place God should occupy in the normal religious life of the faithful. They give them much time. They sacrifice their strength to them. They give up many things for them in what resembles a kind of detachment. Like ascetics, they give up food and especially sleep in their service, and they begin and end each day with them, just like religious folk with their morning and evening prayers. It's kind of like, whoa. To what extent are we going to value the practices, and to what extent is following Jesus possible without them in this moment? You know what Troy read, and if you're like, man, he could read anything. Yeah, he's remarkable. He's a radio guy. But the parable of the sower, maybe you're not familiar with it. Maybe you are. I think there's just a couple simple observations that I'd like to make, because it's a story about a farmer who went out and scattered seed. And in places like Nazareth, I've walked in these fields. The gardens, they're terraced gardens. They're often built into the side of a hill. There's what we would call a retaining wall. Most of them aren't the size of this room, and that's what a family had to supply and to grow what they needed for their family and to have something to trade. But they didn't have drones to plant the seeds or tractors with big long arms and big fat tires. They had to plant the seed with their hands. And so the story is about a farmer who went out scattering seed. And some of it fell on the place where he was walking. And we can all appreciate, like, it's annoying when you try to shovel that spot that you just walked on. Similar. It doesn't work. Some of it fell just on the edge of that where it was a little bit stirred up, but kind of like in Montana when you're like, I'm a gardener because things are growing in May, and then you put it outside and it's 95 degrees and they're dead. Similar dynamic. Some of it fell and weeds just kind of crowded it out and made it impossible for it to be fruitful. And some fell in a place where they were fruitful. Well, and this is pretty rudimentary, but the observations that stand out to me is there's three variables in that story. There's the farmer, but his variable, the X in the formula, if you will, it's static. Like, he's equally as available to all four soils. The same could be said of the seed. It also, like, Y is static. It doesn't say, like, well, he gave a bunch of seed to this part of the ground and a little bit to this ground. No, it says he just scattered it. What's the dynamic variable? It's the soil. And the church historically has seen that through two lenses, and I tend to be the type that's like, if a bunch of smart people saw it through that lens, they must be right, and if they saw it through that lens, they must be right, so I go with both. Because on the one hand, there's been this emphasis on, like, those soils represent different types, different people. And there's those people, and those people, and those people, and those people. And to some extent, you can see that narrative in the Gospel of Matthew. But the other lens says, no, those are every one of us, and it speaks to the life that every one of us can live. And we can all appreciate being in these seasons of, like, man, I'm really going to buckle down, and then, oh man, it's summer, all my constraints are gone. But the part that stood out to me when we studied it, and still does, was the refrain in this section of Matthew is Jesus says, whoever has eyes to see and ears to hear. And you may remember what we explored in that season was what he's really saying there is this is going to take work. Like, you're going to have to work for this. Like, I'm just not going to make it easy. Like, it's going to require dedication. It's like maybe going to med school or something. Like, this following Jesus thing, it's available, but it requires your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I think the last question I want to ask is this, number 5. If Narrate ceased to exist tomorrow, how would you reorganize your life, especially your spiritual life? Now, I recognize that it would be possible for me to be really emotionally manipulative with that question. That's not my intent. I'm not foreshadowing anything. I don't think this is happening. I'm also not asking for your compliment or your praises. I appreciate that. It's been a question I've used for a few months now, and it's actually been really, really helpful to me. Because to me, it's the type of question that allows you to go, okay, if that happened, what are the things that I'd be looking to replace? What are the things I wouldn't be looking to replace? What are the things that I'm currently doing that I'd want to keep doing? And what are the things that I'm not doing that I'd want to start doing? And it kind of brings me to this place of integrity. Like, if there's something about this that I would want to replace, then am I fully giving myself to this? And if there's something about this that I wouldn't replace, then maybe what I need to do is be honest and make some hard decisions and do some pruning with respect to this. You know, to what extent would you be looking for a place to be every Sunday? I think is a great starting point. I've spent a lot of time with it, and while I'm about 99% sure I won't ever pastor another church, I think I can say with utmost integrity, I'd be looking for a place to go every Sunday. I think that's because, I think there's lots of reasons, but there's two that stand out to me. First of all, I've had a front row seat for the last 20 years as to what a person gets when they just choose to be regular in a space. The connection that comes from that is in my opinion, and consistent with my desires for life, it's pretty profound. You know, oftentimes, one of my least favorite words on the planet is the word click, and I'll hear people say, Narrate's clicky, because there's in people and out people. And that's always going to be true on some level, but here would be my opinion of that. You show me somebody who, quote unquote, is in, and I'll bet you money you're pointing to someone who's here most of the time. And you show me someone who's out, and it's not a value statement. It's just, and I say this to people all the time, like if I'm standing here, and over here is somebody who's here once every 6 weeks, and over here is somebody who's here most of the time, relationally, where are you going? Who are you investing in? Who are you leaning into? So there's the Sunday piece. There's also things like, what would you stop doing? Like I just recognized that for me, 5 years ago, like lots of technology and video and lights and all that stuff, it would have been high on my list. And if I'm being honest, it's not anymore. It's why actually I think I would end up at either Our Lady of the Valley or the Cathedral. And that's not even because of my high affinity with Catholic theology necessarily, but just there's lots of reasons, not the least of which is I'm not sure that I'd want to end up in a Protestant church right away. But when I go to and I did this fall with some of my boys. We went to a couple churches in Billings, and they just hit the ball out of the park with technology. And I had this sense of like, I need a space who helps rescue me from those distractions, not reinforces them. I'm not looking to be entertained. I'm looking to do some kind of sacrament. I'm trying to be present. This is my bias. I'm not saying it's exclusive for everybody. I think I'd want to get back into reading recreationally. It's something I do. I read it professionally at work, but Teresa, I don't read as a recreation at home like I used to, and that's on me. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, if I would do that, if the job went away, then how do I reincorporate that back into my life now? What about you? What's the stuff that you would like finally get rid of? And what's the stuff that you'd be looking to replace? You know, ultimately, here's, I think, what we're trying to do, what I hope I'm doing for you this morning is just make this observation, that in life, we most of the time drift towards the wrong things. Like a person naturally drifts towards, like, credit card debt. You naturally drift towards being an alcoholic. You naturally drift towards being unhealthy and out of shape and overweight. You naturally drift towards divorce. Like those things happen most of the time without any like need for discipline. But like becoming the type of human that Jesus compels us to be requires work. Having the relationship with Christ and the communion with Him that you want requires work. Having a great marriage, being disciplined in your finances, accomplishing your physical goals, those take work and discipline. My hope this morning, if nothing else, is that it's this kind of like, okay, as school starts, before we jump back into another September, and then by November we'll be making excuses that it's Christmas, and then we'll be talking about like, oh yeah, when it's the new year, and then it'll be summer, and we'll be going like, oh yeah, September. Like, what if there's just this chance to break that cycle and give yourself a little space to, okay, so how do I sit with these questions and prune some things and add some things? What would that look like for you? And here's the irony. We won't be here next Sunday, and the irony of that's not lost on me. I don't love that we shut down on Sundays, but if I'm being honest, the volunteers that are around here during the summer, that's not a shaming statement to those of you who aren't, and the staff in general, like we operate on such thin margins through the summer that just taking Labor Day weekend off is this way of making sure that we're energized in September, not just exhausted. So here would be my challenge is don't skip church next week. Go for a walk. Make some waffles. Like have some kind of intentional conversation with your family, with your roommates, with yourself, with friends, and sit with the like, okay, so what are you going to do with these things? And what might it look like to move forward in different directions that, if nothing else, leaves your integrity more intact? So I'm going to pray. The band's going to come forward. If you're not taking communion with us, we go row by row. You can skip it if you're not comfortable. That's fine. And then I'll jump up and lead us through it together. God, Lord, there's so much to consider here, and landmines everywhere, and opportunity, I hope, everywhere. Lord, ironically, I take us back to those brilliant words of Ted Lasso and just say, God, would you please spark in us curiosity? My prayer would be that you'd give us the wisdom to hear how it is you're directing us and our family in this season, and then the courage and fortitude to do it. We love you, Lord. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.